Now, a Bahraini activist has lost his life in the country's jail prison due to medical negligence. Victim has been identified as Mohammed Sahwan. He had been injured by a shotgun bullets. Now, Sahwan was deprived of 3 years. He was arrested back in 2011 after protests erupted against the ruling Al Khalifa regime. Scores of demonstrators have been killed and hundreds of others jailed since then. Protesters are demanding that the Al Khalifa dynasty relinquish power and let a fair system representing all Bahrainis be established. Now we're joined by Mr. Edward Corrigan out of Toronto, Canada, human rights activist and journalist. Hello, Mr. Corrigan. Thank you for joining us back on the program, sir. Now, your views, please, on the fate of this young man in a Bahraini prison and many like him.
Well, of course, it's a crime under international law. First, he shouldn't have been probably arrested for peacefully protesting against what is essentially an autocratic, feudal regime. It calls itself a constitutional democracy, but it really is a feudal dictatorship. That's one thing. The whole situation in Bahrain has been deteriorating more and more since the outbreak of the protests in 2011. There's been more and more attacks. Recently, the Human Rights Watch report just came out attacking the treatment of peaceful protests and saying an attack on freedom of speech and other things, use of torture, the failure of the government to react to torture. There was the execution of 3 Bahrainis. It's reliable sources say that the confessions were obtained by torture, and that means that they're invalid, but also there's no prosecution of the people who did the torture, and I guess in the eyes of many people, the executions were, of course, illegal. Same thing with Amnesty International. The government is harassing now the, I guess, family members of a prominent Bahraini activist who was driven out of the country. He had been tortured, put in prison. The United Kingdom has actually granted him asylum and permission to stay there, but they can't reach him in England, so now they're harassing and threatening the family members to try to get him. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Ziyad, he just recently came out with a report, and he also strongly criticized the Bahrain government. He said that increasing levels of human rights violations of Bahrain, he said this repression will not eliminate people's grievances, it will only increase them. So we have, UN, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch criticizing them. There is, growing voices in Europe and other places. But as your previous speaker mentioned, the United States and Britain have sort of exempted themselves from criticism of human rights and have not brought themselves subject to the International Criminal Court of Justice. But of course, they want to put all the people they don't like before those, even if Milosevic, who actually was acquitted. But the Americans and the British basically say that they're above the law, but they're happy to use the legal system against their political opponents, but they don't want to subject themselves to the same law, despite rhetoric that they, of course, would not violate human rights. The Americans are terrible. The British are terrible. Bahrain, of course, is a majority Shia country. The government's repressing both the Shia parties, but also now the secular left party that they're planning to shut down. And they have also approved recently that they're going to prosecute civilians in the military courts for basically peacefully protesting. One person was sentenced to 37 months in jail. Among her offenses was she tore up a picture of the King of Bahrain. They did release her after a while on human rights and humanitarian compassionate considerations, but she left the country. So we have a terrible, terrible situation in Bahrain. But the people that count, the Americans, the British, I suppose, the Saudis, and the other feudal states in the area, people were criticized for, put in jail and arrested for criticizing the Saudi Arabia bombing of Yemen, which has been widely condemned around the world. So, there's no freedom of speech, there's no political freedom in the country, and the situation getting worse. And as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said, this situation is only going to make the situation worse, and in my opinion, much more explosive.
And we have less than a minute left. Really quick, Mr. Corrigan, one last question. So why is it that we don't hear Western media outlets or even governments report on that much or even condemn the human rights situation in Bahrain?
Well, the American Congress, the British Parliament, they like the money that they make there by selling arms to Bahrain and, of course, to Saudi Arabia and other countries that also have pretty bad and terrible human rights situations. There is some congressmen and some people in the European Parliament. The British Guardian has been pretty good in covering the situation. But it's when you've got, I guess, other distractions like Syria people aren't interested in the tiny place of the island of Bahrain. And of course, the United States has the Fifth Fleet based there. And also there's British troops based there. So there's the corporate media is not really willing to question the government and to perhaps raise questions why there's massive support for these governments. And of course, they are very helpful because they have military bases there, which strategically allow them to project power all through the Gulf region, and that, like the previous speaker said, also help them to control, the straits going in for the Persian Gulf and also the Red Sea. So this is, I think, part of it. It's self-interest, it's greed, it's hypocritical, and of course, in the long run, I think it is quite irrational and also self-defeating.
Thank you much, Mr. Edward Corrigan, for joining us once again, sir. Human rights activist and journalist joining us out of Toronto.